The Federal Aviation Administration's Aviation Safety Program has developed this training in an effort to assist instructors and those who serve in the evaluation process to help create meaningful and practical scenarios for use during flight training. The objective of this training is to enable instructors to develop good judgment and aeronautical decision-making skills in their students. Pilot examiners and aviation safety inspectors should also benefit from this program in being able to develop similar type scenarios when evaluating pilot applicants. In reviewing recent aviation accident and incident statistics, we can recognize some of the major causal factors leading to accidents, primarily the human factor element. The pilot is the direct causal factor in 75% of all aviation accidents. Even though we blame the pilot in most aviation accidents, we need to realize that the accident or incident chain starts early. Poor judgment usually begins during pre-flight planning and preparation. This lack of judgment, or rather good judgment, can be attributed to poor training, lack of experience, or lack of proficiency. As you can see, some of the major factors contributing to aviation accidents include poor pre-flight of the aircraft, inadequate planning due to lack of receiving a proper weather briefing, poor decision-making once airborne and en route, and the act of eliminating options for leaving yourself an out as the flight continues. On average, over the past few years, the NTSB accident statistics indicate that 24% of the total accidents occurred during the takeoff phase, 10% during the descent approach phase, and 38% during the landing phase of flight. If you compare the amount of flight time involved in these three phases to the total flight time of a normal flight, over 72% of the accidents occur during a very short period of time. The fact is that these three phases of flight occur during a high workload period while operating close to the ground. The fatality rate for weather-related accidents was 15% of the total accidents. These statistics are alarming. Most of these accidents indicate a failure of the pilot to recognize a poor decision or a failure to make a decision in a timely manner. This is where you, as a flight instructor, can play a vital role in bringing about a positive change for the aviation industry. The practical test standards and regulations require that flight instructors educate students on how to make sound decisions. As an instructor, you have the responsibility and flexibility in developing lessons to challenge and enhance a student's skill in applying safe and effective judgment. The tools you use help expose the student to the decision-making process early during their training. As flight instructors, we know that during the practical test, it's common for evaluators to use scenarios to test the student's ability to make safe, sound decisions. The decision-making training tools that we use during initial and recurrent training influence how a pilot makes decisions throughout their flying career. Remember, a key factor is how well we train the pilot. This will determine how they perform during the real situation. The scenarios provided during this training session should be used during initial, recurrent, and advanced training, including flight reviews. Let's look at some realistic scenarios that can put the participants' decision-making abilities into action. Feel free to use or modify any of these during your flight training evaluations.
This is a pre-flight situation where a student and instructor are slowly walking around the aircraft checking different components. During the pre-flight, the student encounters a questionable airworthiness situation.
No loose pins, they're safetied. No obstructions or loose panels, skins underneath. No damage at the stabilator tip. No damage on the lower fin. ELT antenna is secure. And no damage on the flap edge. Landing gear looks good.
Okay. All right. I'll do that.
Brakes are okay. Bruce, come here a second. This tire's showing some wear. I can't tell what's going on. What do you think? Is this worth canceling a flight for?
As an instructor, what would you do if a student asked you a question like this? Would you tell the student what to do and why? Let the student figure it out for themselves and intervene if necessary? Or would you let the student decide? After all, it is their chance to make a decision. Let's see how this instructor handles it.
First of all, that's a good catch, Pierre. That could be a potential problem. But let's pretend that I'm not here for a minute. What would you do?
I'd probably call the nearest mechanic and see what they thought.
That's a great idea. Why don't you do just that? Go find a mechanic and see what they think.
I'll do that. Thank you.
It's certainly worn there. don't know what type of landings you're going to be doing, whether it's uneven surfaces, heavy braking, or possible side loads. We can change it now, or we can wait till you get back.
Now the student is faced with making some real pilot and command decisions. He must use some decision-making tools that factor in on the safety of the flight. From what we have observed in this scenario, the instructor allowed the student to seek outside information to build on his own decision-making process. But by receiving this outside input, it still places the student in a position to make a pilot and command decision. The student will then weigh all the risk factors as provided by the instructor.
This next scenario could be used during an engine run-up before flight. In this case, the instructor challenges the pilot's knowledge about the engine magneto system.
Before you check that magneto, can you tell me what an acceptable indication would be during a check?
Sure. An acceptable magneto check would be 100 to 125 RPM drop. The difference between the two magneto drops should not be more than 50 RPM.
Great. Okay, well, what would you consider doing if the magneto check resulted in abnormal roughness?
Frankly, I don't know what I would do. Can you help me out?
Well, you have several options. Let's explore some of them. Have you checked the logbook for any previous write-ups about problems with this engine?
Yeah, I did before we came on board.
Okay. Well, what's the likelihood of having fuel contamination? Listen to the engine. You also have the option of running the engine at a higher power setting and leaning the mixture back. This can sometimes clear a foul spark plug. If you decide to do this, you'll need to return the mixture to full rich, unless you're at a high altitude airport. Then reduce the throttle back to the proper RPM and conduct another magneto check.
In this situation, the instructor has become a valuable resource for the student pilot, while allowing the student to explore different possibilities about the situation. Effective aeronautical decision-making, or ADM, is a systematic mental process that helps pilots decide the best course of action for a given set of circumstances. An instructor should encourage and reinforce a student's ability to question their judgment at every step in the training process, helping them to anticipate the outcome of each decision made. Over time, ADM should become an automatic process. The next scenario examines the causes of poor decision-making. While numerous circumstances can apply to this context, this scenario addresses decisions made about fuel and whether or not to continue to a pre-planned destination. Every year, approximately 5% of all accidents involve pilots making the wrong decision about fuel management. While many scenarios can be developed to demonstrate poor decision-making, fuel consumption is just one topic among many that can be explored. What is it that causes a pilot to make poor decisions? Let's see how this instructor develops a scenario to put a student pilot's decision-making abilities to the test.
Sure is a nice day out here. I don't think we could have planned this any better.
Isn't that the truth? Mm-hmm. This is a perfect day for doing some cross-country training. What airport was that we just passed?
I believe it was the downtown air park.
Good.
The instructor and the student are flying and are more than halfway along on their cross-country flight. The instructor asks the student the current status of the fuel supply.
While we're flying along here, let's just say hypothetically that you look down at your gauges. And notice at this point in your flight that the fuel gauges are indicating about 1/4 full. What would you do?
Are we assuming that we started on a full tank?
Yes, 36 gallons worth.
Well, I doubt it would have taken us 24 gallons to fly an hour. But if it did, I'd say we have a problem.
Okay. Acknowledging that you do have a potential problem, what could be the probable causes? As you begin troubleshooting, go ahead and verbalize for me some of the causes of the fuel problem.
Well, it's possible that I misread the gauge, so I may want to check it again. Or it's possible that the gauge is reading inaccurately, although I tend to trust my instruments. There could be a fuel leak. However, I don't remember seeing any fuel leaks on the pre-flight. But it could be a new instead of pre-existing condition.
Good. Anything else?
It's possible that I may need to recheck my calculations. And keeping track of my fuel consumption, I know that this airplane normally uses about 9 gallons of fuel per hour. But if the gauges are indicating a quarter of a tank, this means I have about 10 gallons remaining.
Based on the student pilot's knowledge about the fuel situation, their present location, and other factors, some important decisions need to be made. Primarily, the concern should be whether to continue flying or alter the course and land.
Are you aware that by slowing down the speed of the aircraft, you can save fuel? Slowing down your speed burns less fuel. It becomes more economical.
Oh, just like driving your car.
That's right.
The student is presented with several possibilities as to why a fuel problem would exist and some alternatives in dealing with it. Another possibility exists, one that is difficult for any pilot to admit, and that is acknowledging that a mistake could have been made during pre-flight. Regardless of the cause of the problem, a decision must be made. Is it a go or a no-go situation? For many pilots, some are anxious to get home and can easily overlook potential problems, whereas some pilots may consider a minor problem an inconvenience, something that can be addressed later. And as we know, it's those little things that can grow quickly into big things, eventually eliminating a pilot's possible options. So what is your prediction of the actions of this particular student pilot? Think about the consequences involved with each of the different options. Factors like the current time of day and weather conditions are likely to be a consideration in the decision-making process.
You know, based on all the information I have at my disposal, I think at this point I'm going to slow my speed down and divert back to that airport we passed earlier. It's closer than our intended destination, and since it's getting dark, I'd rather play it safe.
I hear you.
It's nice to know we're working with a conscientious pilot. The fuel scenario is just one among many scenarios that can be used at any pilot skill level. Regardless of the problem-solving technique, the objective is to emphasize that a pilot must maintain situational awareness at all times during a flight, whether it is a fuel problem, weather situation, or mechanical problem. A pilot should be cognizant of how long they've been flying, how far they have to go, and when it's necessary to make a determination whether to divert or alter their intended course. The optimum skill in decision-making is to make decisions early while you still have options. The more one delays making decisions, the more narrowed the alternatives become, conceivably jeopardizing the safety of the flight.
This next scenario involves weather and controlled flight into terrain, also known as CFIT. Accident statistics today constantly reflect that pilots are continuing their flights into weather conditions beyond their flying capabilities and are not staying situationally aware of the surrounding terrain. Unfortunately, most pilots believe that CFIT accidents can only happen in mountainous terrain. As statistics show, this is not true. These types of accidents can happen anywhere.
This next example demonstrates how an instructor develops a weather-related scenario. The student and the instructor take off on a cross-country flight and climb to a safe altitude for the route of the flight. They observe a broken to overcast condition up ahead. This forces the pilot to descend the aircraft. How much lower would he be willing to go before he made a decision to turn back?
You're doing really well with your training. And since we're working with some low cloud cover today, I wanted to work through some possible real flying scenarios involving weather.
Oh, well, I'm just a student pilot. I'm not IFR rated. I don't know if I have the ability to
Don't worry
do
about
weather.
it. Don't worry. You'll be fine. This is just part of your training. And I wouldn't allow you to put either one of us in a bad situation anyway, okay? Feel comfortable with that?
Yeah.
Okay. And using that cloud deck up ahead, the one that's broken to overcast, let's assume that we called flight service and they told us that this broken to overcast layer stays the same all the way to our destination. So, considering that's what's going to happen, that's the way it is, we can't get through it. We're stuck on top, or we could be. So based on what you know, what will we need to do next?
Knowing that the weather's going down at our destination, we're going to need to get under that cloud deck. I recommend we descend at 3,500 feet.
Okay, since we're at 3,500 and I'm going to once again simulate that the cloud deck lets us go down an additional 300 feet. We're down to 3.2 at 3,200 feet. And as we descend and get below the cloud deck, let's pretend the visibility decreases down to 5 miles. So let's go ahead and descend to 3,200. Okay, how much further west do you think you can go, factoring in your flying experience and the fact that the cloud deck, could get better, but it also might get worse?
Well, we are still at VFR. Visibility isn't too bad. We are getting lower. I can see the interstate beneath us. I really am a lot lower than I like to be in this area. And with the weather going down and the terrain slope uphill in a westerly direction, my present position, I'm 1,300 feet above the ground. That doesn't take into account local antennas or obstacles in the area. At this point, I'd like to land and replan this flight.
The student pilot has made a wise decision to land the aircraft. Landing allows the pilot more options in decision-making. For instance, now he can examine the weather from all perspectives. The student pilot can rechart the intended course based on current conditions. The student pilot can look at the price of getting a taxi and a motel in the area if conditions are too bad. And as noted earlier, many situational factors can come into play. Let's say the pilot was renting the aircraft. Some decisions may be based on getting the aircraft back in a timely manner versus making a few phone calls. From this scenario, we can observe that the decision-making process needs to begin early. The point being that when the weather is deteriorating, a decision needs to be made, either to turn around or divert from your course while there is still good visibility and adequate terrain clearance, or to continue the flight, accepting all the associated risks and consequences. Delaying a decision may eventually eliminate all the student pilot's options. Even though this scenario was depicted over somewhat flat terrain, instructors should use the local area where they teach to include rapid, rising terrain, and local weather hazards affiliated with the area.
The next scenario involves decision-making between landing or diverting to another airport. Statistics show that approximately 40% of all accidents occur during the landing phase of flight. Crosswinds and gusty conditions contribute to the majority of landing accidents.
In this scenario, the winds are strong but okay for the departure airport. The instructor has the student fly to another airport where the crosswind is within AFM POH safe limitations, but beyond the student's capabilities. How do you think the student will handle the situation?
It looks like they're using runway 17 left or right at Page. I think we'll head over there and set up for the long runway 17 right.
Okay.
Page, Unicom Cessna 6336 Victor, entering a right downwind for 17 right, Page.
I don't see any traffic.
The student pilot is about to experience a phenomenon that can occur at any airport. During this session of takeoffs and landings, the student notices a difficult time controlling the aircraft and that the wind is increasing and shifting to a crosswind.
Helicopter's taking off.
Right.
Bearing 11 kilo, Fox is turning final 17 of chip shift.
Getting gusty down here. Wind's turning more into a crosswind. I don't like this. I'm going around.
What's wrong?
Well, I was getting gusty and turbulent, and I realized that crosswind might be beyond my ability.
You want to go back and try it again?
Let's call Wiley Post Tower and check the surface winds over there.
Okay, 126.9 tower frequency.
Wiley Post Tower, Cessna 6336 Victor, 15 southwest.
Cessna 36 Victor, Wiley Post Tower.
36 Victor, roger. We were checking touch and goes at Page, and we noticed a significant surface wind change. What are your current winds?
Cessna 36 Victor. Wind 290 at 25, gust 30, peak gust 35 knots at 5 minutes ago.
36 Victor, roger. I'd like to proceed to Wiley Post, and we'd like to utilize runway 31 at Wiley Post. Over.
From this scenario, what do you think the student is going to do? There are several options. If he learned that runway 31 is open, he could land there. If not, he could possibly check with some of the other airports in the area. Sometimes winds can change quickly, and the student pilot could fly around for a short period of time while anticipating a change in the winds. However, we can also make the assumption that winds changed due to a storm forming. We can see that the instructor allowed the student pilot to make his own decision. The student pilot continued the approach and finally realized it was beyond his flying capabilities. The instructor allowed the student to make a go-around decision. The instructor does have the responsibility of not allowing students to go beyond the safe limitations of the airplane or the instructor's ability to recover from an unsafe situation. As with most endeavors like flying, there is a certain amount of risk that is acceptable. It's up to the student to recognize those limits, and it's up to the instructor to point out potential risks when appropriate. A hot subject in aviation safety is runway incursion avoidance. Proper training may be one way that we can alleviate the problem. There are a lot of good training materials available for instructors to use for runway incursion avoidance. Let's look at one instructor's scenario. Flying at an uncontrolled airport can present certain obstacles. For example, this airport does not have a taxiway to take you to the departure runway of 16, so you have to back taxi on the runway. The taxiway is narrow, so pre-planning is necessary if you desire to make a clearing turn to observe traffic from this position on the taxiway. A student pilot must be extra vigilant about the surroundings, especially when flying alone and being unable to rely on an extra set of eyes.
Our run-up is complete. This sure is a tight area to maneuver in to clear the traffic pattern. I've been listening to the radio, and I know there's another aircraft out there. I guess I could make the call in the blind.
I saw the guy leaving on the lawnmower a little bit ago. Did you happen to see where he went?
Not exactly. Do I need to worry about him too?
I'd say there are several factors at work here that you need to consider.
While the student is taxiing forward in hopes of seeing the traffic pattern a little better, there's always a need to stay aware of what's going on around you. Looking at this situation, let's assess several factors. Besides air traffic in the area, there are other considerations. The man with the lawn cutting equipment needs to be considered, especially if grass cuttings or other types of FAAD are blown onto the runway. Maintenance vehicles should be another calculated obstacle, especially if they begin working on airport equipment. The people riding bicycles can also present traffic in the area, especially if they turn in your direction. People working in their hangars bringing their pets should also be a consideration. There are numerous opportunities for incursions, some obvious and some not so obvious. Even stirring up your own direct prop blast can FAAD a runway. Be cautious of your operations and your surroundings. Expect the unexpected. In this scenario, we can see the instructor allowed the student to demonstrate their decision-making process by using good judgment and observing the entire traffic pattern before taxiing onto the runway. However, are there other items that we should be aware of? Could the student have planned better? What could the student have done with regard to run-up and other aircraft in the area? We've linked scenarios that can be used at uncontrolled and controlled airports. Because of the congestion and complexity of the situation, be careful when operating at a controlled airport. Not only the student, but the instructor can get easily distracted. Let's see how this instructor formulates a challenging scenario for the student pilot.
Wiley Post Ground Cessna 55146, AAR with information Bravo, ready to taxi.
Now it's important that the student pilot gets the taxi instructions correctly and writes them down prior to moving.
Cessna 55146, taxi to runway 13 via taxiway Lima and Charlie, hold short of runway 17 left.
Taxi runway 13 via taxiway Lima and Charlie, hold short of runway 17 left. Looks like they're going to give us the short taxi route to runway 13.
Yes, don't worry about it. Sometimes they'll do that.
For the student, it is of utmost importance that taxi clearances are adhered to, but it's important to realize that other distractions can develop.
Cessna 146, I have an amendment to your departure instructions. Advise when you're ready to copy.
Go ahead.
On departure, turn right heading 200, climb and maintain 3000. Expect 6000 10 minutes after departure.
We need to hold short.
Now it's time to get the student pilot thinking. What could he have done to prevent this? If he wasn't ready, should he have asked ATC to stand by? Should he have just stopped what he was doing? What kinds of scenarios do you see developing here? What are a student's options? What should he do? What would you, as an instructor, do in this situation, especially in preventing it from getting to this point? We can see from this scenario that sometimes the instructor does not have to do too much planning to wind up with a judgment training situation presenting itself. The student pilot was about to cross his hold point while ATC and an instructor diverted his attention. In this case, the student created a bad situation by losing his primary focus of controlling the aircraft. He was more interested in answering the controllers. The difference between good judgment and bad judgment can be a matter of deciding priorities. In this instance, the priorities of a flight are the control of the aircraft and adherence to taxi instructions. In some flight operations, not enough information is available. There are instances in which manuals, checklists, and training simply does not provide solutions to abnormal instances. Sometimes training does not address a situation that seldom occurs. Normally, the magneto check addresses the drop in the RPM or a comparison in the two magnetos. In this scenario, the student encounters a situation rarely experienced.
Looking at my tachometer, neither magneto appears to have dropped.
And?
From what I understand, the normal indication is to have an RPM drop. I've not encountered a situation like this.
So what do you think you should do?
I'm not sure if I can make an educated guess about this one. Right now, my decision is whether to fly the airplane or not. The drop does not exceed the limitations on the checklist. And the drop is less than 200 RPMs per magneto, and the difference between the two is less than 50. So, I don't think the engine's faulty. And since we won't be able to get or rent this aircraft next week, it may be 3 weeks before we can get together again. So, I think we'll be okay.
Well, don't you think that if you're not sure of the seriousness of this abnormality, that it might be better to keep it on the ground and get some advice?
Some situations are better determined on the ground before they become an emergency situation in flight. As we observed in this scenario, the student pilot perhaps placed some unnecessary time pressures on the situation. In many instances, improper decisions are made in haste, instead of looking at the big picture and arriving at a decision in a more logical manner. The fact that neither magneto dropped indicates that the magneto is not being grounded out properly and therefore not being isolated, indicating a 0 RPM drop. Consequently, the aircraft is not safe to fly. The instructor has provided the student pilot with additional pilot and command decision-making tools about one of the aircraft systems. A similar type of scenario can be developed using any of the aircraft systems during pre-takeoff or before flight checklist items.
This guy continuously makes bad decisions. How can I possibly help him?
The instructor has many options for obtaining assistance when a student continually demonstrates to have poor judgment. And it's important to note that there are different levels of having bad judgment. One option for an instructor in aiding a student is to introduce the student to an aeronautical decision-making model, known as the 3 Ps. This model is an effective way to manage the flow of information. You first perceive, then process, and then perform. At every stage of flight, there are continuing situations that require recognition, or the ability to perceive. Then a student pilot must make decisions. This is the process. And then the student pilot must act upon that decision or choose not to act. Either action becomes a perform function. Instructors can encourage students to read more training materials to become better educated about a particular aircraft and the mechanics of flying. Another option is to network with other pilots in the industry. Talk to those who have some experience in certain situations and inquire how they handled the circumstance. And lastly, remember, the FAA Aviation Safety Office is a vital resource for any aeronautical enthusiast. Incidentally, the FAA's Aviation Safety Program Office has multiple training materials available. One training package that might be beneficial for students who continually convey improper decision-making abilities is a training package entitled Aeronautical Decision Making. The package consists of a DVD, an educational video, and PowerPoint training to help walk through some areas for students needing additional guidance. If interested, contact your local FAA Flight Standards District Office Safety Program Manager for details.
The Aviation Safety Program has presented these scenarios that any instructor can use during initial or recurrent or advanced training. Examiners and inspectors can use these same or similar scenarios during evaluations. Whether you use the examples or develop some of your own, it is important that every instructor use some type of scenario to help develop good judgment and aeronautical decision-making skills. The key point is that we want the pilots we train and endorse to be safe and enjoy their flying careers. The instructor is the one who holds the key to aviation safety training and helps develop good judgment and aeronautical decision-making skills.